our freedom, our sense of being able to really be at home, to feel at ease, is inextricably all connected. We are all impacted by the suffering that exists in the world. How do we hold that? And how can we come together to find ways to be able to transform it?
My talk is on the question, are we wired for compassion? The field of neuroscience and psychology have been looking into this question for the past couple of decades. And we're actually finding that not only does it seem like we're wired for compassion, but we actually have a bias built in for compassion.
So my talk is on shifting conversations here in the United States about Israelis and Palestinians. Why do we have compassion for the people that we do? And who is missing from those conversations about compassion? Who's not being talked about in a compassionate way? Who's not being presented in an empathetic light? And why is that?
When we talk about the pandemic, what we're actually talking about is the trauma. It's grief. Maybe it's new for us, but not so new for a lot of communities, right? There's a kind of resiliency that I talk about. There's a resiliency, an emotional resiliency that we have to train. And that emotional resiliency is really about connecting to sources of support.
When we can first begin to really sense and feel ourselves as being recipients of care, that really helps us to begin to connect with our own capacities to feel care for others.
Very recently, some researchers at Princeton University actually found that if you think about removing pain or lessening that person's suffering, you actually get reward centers lighting up in your brain. You're hardwired for this, but there are certain things you can do to train it. So my talk will have a sprinkling of different types of practices that you can do and things that you might not be thinking of as compassion training. So going to the homeless shelter, for example, and giving some of your time, that's a compassion training.
I came across a poem in Arabic called Rivers, and it took me a while, and then I realized that's Langston Hughes, written in Arabic. Palestinians everywhere have found a deep resonance with the experiences of Black Americans. So part of my research has been uncovering that history, and I'm excited to share it with the Downtown Lecture Series audience.
If our hearts can't open, we can't transform, we can't evolve, right? And this is both individual work and collective work. When something becomes collective, then we begin to see huge shifts in systems that are perpetually harmful. Having an experience of compassion and experience of being cared for is really imperative for many of us right now.
Thanks everyone for coming. My name is J.P. Jones. I'm the Don Bennett Moon Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and it's a pleasure to see so many people here at the Fox. And I know there are a lot of people who are watching us on live stream. Thank you for coming to the third installment of our 2021 series on compassion. Last week we saw an amazing lecture on the science of compassion from the standpoint of evolution and cognitive science. And this week we're going to turn to the social and political dimensions of compassion with insight into questions like, why should we be compassionate for distant others? Or why should we have compassion for those who are different but near? Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank Bonnie Schock and the team at the Fox Tucson Theater for all their support in making sure that this lecture series went as smoothly as it has. And also our supporting sponsor, our series sponsor, the Stonewall Foundation Fund. And thank you, Rick and Bill and Kathleen Small for your support. Our supporting sponsors are Mike and Beth Kasser and Halo'olua Companies, and I want to give a shout out to Mike and Beth for all the philanthropy that they do that supports so many things, intellectual and artistic, here in our community. And our other supporting sponsor is Tucson Medical Center Healthcare, and they've been so happy with this series that they're thinking of calling themselves Tucson Most Compassionate Healthcare from here on out. Thank you. That did not turn into a dad joke, and I'm quite surprised, actually. Our other sponsors include Dr. Barbara Starrett and Joanne Ellison, and Roween Aguirre Medina and Roy Medina, and then finally Tiana and Jeff Ronstadt. I'd like to thank all of them, as well as Tucson Lifestyle and John Hudak for helping us obtain support from Tucson Lifestyle. So thank all of you. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Maha Nasser, and she is an associate professor in SBS's School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies. Maha received her PhD from the University of Chicago in Near East languages and civilizations. And she is a cultural and intellectual historian with a primary focus on the political and literary life of Palestinians in post-1948, following the establishment of the State of Israel. In addition to many articles and book chapters, she is the author of an award-winning book titled Brothers Apart: Palestinian Citizens in Israel and the Arab World. And this book chronicles the writings of the Palestinian intelligentsia from 1948 to 1967, particularly the ones in Israel, who were trying to hold the identity of Palestinians together while an increasingly diasporic community is leaving the area. Experts in Middle Eastern studies have referred to this book as extraordinary, a masterpiece, and my personal favorite for an academic book, wondrous. Quite a compliment. Her current work is contracted with Princeton University Press and continues her analysis of Palestinian identity. Maha Nasser has some claim to be among the top in her generation of Palestinian public intellectuals through the works that she has produced for outlets like Washington Post and The Hill and many, many other public fora where her opinions and analyses are printed, as well as traveling to many public venues like the one we're in tonight to talk about her work. And lastly, I would be remiss if I did not mention that she is a fabulous, exceptional teacher. She's thoughtful, she's careful, she's dedicated, and her students, in spite of the fact that she teaches some of the most difficult material on the Arab-Israeli conflict, on politics in the Middle East more generally, and on Islamic thought, her students give her glowing, glowing recommendations. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Maha Nasser.
Thank you. Wow, what an honor to be here tonight. Thank you, J.P. Jones, and to Maribel Alvarez for inviting me to be part of this phenomenal series. And thank you all for coming out tonight and for logging in. And also, a huge thanks to the entire team and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, who've been working so hard behind the scenes and backstage to put together this phenomenal series. Let's give them a round of applause, too. So as JP mentioned, some of what I have to cover may be a bit uncomfortable. So I'm going to ask you to join me first in taking a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And then one more deep breath in and one more out. Well, I feel better. So I have a confession to make. When I first read the email inviting me to be a part of this year's Downtown Lecture Series, and that the topic was compassion, my first thought was, maybe there's been a mistake. After all, my subject area, Palestinian and Israeli history, is not exactly a topic that we usually associate with the word compassion. But then I thought about it a bit more, and I realized that one of the really interesting phenomena that I've noticed happening in recent years is that there's a shift in the language here in the United States in how we talk about Palestinians and Israelis. And it's some of those shifts that I want to talk to you about tonight. But there's another reason I'm excited to be here with you as well. I've long been an avid reader of books on meditation and spirituality. And I'm also a practicing Muslim, as you may have guessed. And so I turn to the Quran for spiritual guidance as well. And I've noticed a lot of convergence between these two realms of my spiritual life, particularly when it comes to the topic of compassion. Muslims believe that God has 99 divine names, or attributes. These names represent characteristics of God, or Allah in Arabic, even as we know God to be limitless. The characteristic or the attribute that appears most frequently in the Quran is Ar-Rahman, which means the most compassionate. Nearly every one of the Quran's 114 chapters opens with the phrase Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Muslims repeat this phrase repeatedly throughout each of the 5 daily prayers and invoke God's compassion oftentimes when they open a talk. And so tonight, in that tradition, I begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. As Leslie and Jay mentioned in the previous 2 lectures of this series, empathy and compassion are related yet distinct concepts. Empathy refers to our ability to identify with another person's suffering. Compassion involves holding space for that person's suffering, even if you don't directly identify with them, and also, and this is key, taking meaningful action to try to alleviate some of that suffering. But then a question arises. How do we take meaningful action to alleviate someone's suffering if we don't know what they're going through? How do we hold compassion for people we don't identify with? The answer, in my view, is stories. The stories that we hear about people that we don't know personally or that we're unfamiliar with is key to being able to extend compassion to all. Over the years, numerous polls have shown that by and large, more Americans express sympathy for Israelis as compared to Palestinians. Lots of Pews, like this one from Gallup and others from Pew and other research firms, shows fairly steady results. This particular one from 2000 to the most recent in 2021, again, shows fairly consistent results with some slight changes more recently. We're going to come back to this poll a bit later, but my first question is, why might this be? I would argue that it's because more Americans are familiar with the stories of Israelis. We read about stories from the Holy Land, growing up in biblical accounts, and we hear on television news reporters and others talk about Israeli experiences. Our politicians on both sides of the aisle talk about the United States and Israel as sharing a firm bond based on the idea that they are democratic states, that they are technological pioneers, and that they are protectors of Western security. So Americans are familiar with stories about Israelis. What about Palestinians? As the daughter of Palestinian refugees, I was always interested in learning about Palestinian stories. Because my parents are refugees, I was not allowed to visit their homeland. And so, growing up here in the US, I was always on the lookout for stories that would help connect me to them and their past. Since I couldn't travel there, I would look for them in media sources, newspapers, magazines, news broadcasts. Consuming all of that news, probably more than was necessary, I came across a lot of Israeli stories. Stories about Israelis filled with triumph, filled with tragedy. I found very few stories about Palestinians, and the few I did find usually cast us as the bad guys. But I knew we had stories to tell. I knew from my extended family scattered around the world, I knew from the large Palestinian community in the southwest suburbs of Chicago that we had stories to tell. Interesting, fascinating, complex stories, stories of triumph and tragedy. Where were they? It's easy to miss stories of people that we're unfamiliar with, and it's easy to miss stories that don't fit into our preconceived notions. Social scientists refer to the idea that we piece together information in ways that make sense to us as a discursive framework. And like a picture frame, where we tend to focus on what's inside of the frame rather than outside of it, similarly, we tend to focus on information and process information that fits within our discursive framework, more so than what fits outside of it. When it comes to talking about the United States, our society, our role in the world, and especially when it comes to talking about foreign lands, we tend to think in terms of a couple of discursive frameworks, different ones that I want to share with you tonight. The first is what I call a peace framework. The peace framework, while sounds lovely, as you'll see tonight, can sometimes be problematic. The peace framework tends to be rooted in notions of identity. We want peace, they don't. To shore up that idea, advocates of the peace framework tend to focus on what social scientists and others call spectacular violence. That is, violence as spectacle, the kinds of things that make the front pages of newspapers, the home pages of news websites, and the top of the news broadcasts. And those acts of spectacular violence are then used to reaffirm the identity us versus them framework. You see, they don't want peace. We do. And as a result, it tends to cultivate empathy, a feeling of identifying with victims of suffering, for those with whom they identify. We are suffering from violence. They are causing it. In contrast to the peace framework is what I call the justice framework. Rather than thinking in terms of us versus them, folks in the justice framework tend to think about causes of suffering, regardless of the identity of the person. That's why people in the justice framework often talk about things like coalitions and solidarities. Folks in the justice framework tend to focus on structural violence. That is, the violence that doesn't make the front pages of newspapers. That structural violence is often carried out by the state or by powerful forces against marginalized communities or those who are less powerful. Because they're not grounded in an us versus them identity, because they tend to operate in terms of coalitions and solidarities, and because they recognize the connections between structures of violence around the world, and because they intend on taking meaningful action to alleviate that suffering, I would contend that folks in the justice framework advocate compassion for all. Malcolm X was an important proponent of the justice framework. While he was on Hajj, he wrote a letter to his American friends in which he said, quote, "I'm for truth, no matter who it is for or against. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I am a human being first and foremost, and as such, I am for whoever or whatever benefits humanity as a whole. So Malcolm X here is articulating an idea of compassion for all. But how can we alleviate the suffering of others if we don't know their stories? My quest to learn more about Palestinian stories ultimately led me to graduate school. As JP mentioned, I went to the University of Chicago in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, where I was trained to become a cultural historian. Now, I loved graduate school. For one thing, I met a young man there, a fellow graduate student, who later became my husband and life partner. He didn't know I was going to do that, by the way. But I also enjoyed graduate school because it was the first time that I was finally feeling like I was actually learning those Palestinian stories that I had longed to learn for so long. While I was in graduate school, new research was coming out that shed new light on what happened during the year 1948, the year that the State of Israel was established, but also the year that Palestinians call the Nakba, or the tragedy. Palestinians have long maintained that during that fateful year, over 700,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of the Palestinians living in what became the State of Israel, were forcibly expelled or fled from their homes, becoming refugees, stateless, as they longed to return. Israeli officials had long denied this claim, saying that it wasn't 700,000 and that they weren't forced out, they left on their own. The new research that was coming out based on Israeli archival material, much of it written by Israeli historians, confirmed the Palestinian account. So it signaled to me that history can be a way to recover lost stories. Graduate school was also transformative because it was the first time that I was interacting with Israelis directly. One of my colleagues, a friend of mine, told me once about how her mother as a child had been rescued out of Germany in what became known as the Kindertransport. The rest of her mother's family perished in the Holocaust. I sat with my friend's story for a while. You see, growing up, I had heard a lot about Jewish suffering, and I had heard about the Holocaust and read about it. But it was always in the context of denying Palestinian suffering, denying Palestinian claims for justice. So I had to ask myself, would holding space for her suffering somehow diminish the suffering of my own family? The answer came in another story, this one by Palestinian novelist and writer Ghassan Kanafani. In his novella, Returning to Haifa, Ghassan tells the story of a Palestinian couple that returns to their home in Haifa 20 years after they had been expelled from it. When they arrive, they're greeted by an Israeli Jewish couple, themselves survivors of the Holocaust. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the story, because it's a wonderful story and you should all read it. But what I will say is that Kanafani's depiction of this Israeli Jewish couple and what they went through in the Holocaust and the ongoing traumas they faced, even as we know Ghassan Kanafani to have been an unyielding supporter and champion of Palestinian freedom, taught me that we can and must hold compassion for all people, even as we struggle for justice. Moreover, we must not let the suffering for one group blind us to the suffering of another. For my dissertation, I decided to focus on the tiny minority of Palestinians who did not become refugees when the State of Israel was created. Most of them became Israeli citizens, and they were often touted as evidence of Israel's democracy. But I knew from my research that that was not the case. Palestinian citizens of Israel were treated as second-class citizens, placed under martial law, and the vast majority of their lands were colonized by the state. In addition, their political activity was often deemed a security threat, rendering them often jailed, beaten, and even tortured. I hadn't heard much about them growing up, and so I became interested to learn more about their stories. And I decided to look for them in their literary writings, in their poems, in their newspapers, in their literary journals. And what I found became the basis of my book, brothers apart. But reading that poetry, I also got a sense of déjà vu. You see, I was an English major as an undergraduate, and I had been particularly drawn to the writings of Black American writers in the Harlem Renaissance and beyond. And so as I was reading poems by Mahmoud Darwish, by Samih al-Qasim, I noticed resonances and similarities to what I had been drawn to as an undergrad. One day, in the midst of my research, I came across a poem titled in Arabic Al-Anhar, which means rivers. At first, I thought it was a poem by a Palestinian. It turned out to be a translation of Langston Hughes's famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I had loved reading The Negro Speaks of Rivers as a younger person. And so the fact that it not only resonated with me, but resonated with the Palestinians that I was studying, signaled to me that compassion extends beyond particularities of where we live or who we identify with. That really true compassion can extend across the world. But there was more. Another time I was reading an essay by Mahmoud Darwish. He's known for his poetry, but he also wrote essays. And in this essay in 1966, he writes an open letter to Black Americans in which he writes, quote, When I read the book by our gifted writer, James Baldwin, I felt as if James is writing about me personally, about the quote-unquote Negroes in Israel, with only slight adjustments to the details of the picture. When he wrote about love, he was narrating my love story. And when he wrote about hate, he reflected my hate. Now, elsewhere in the essay, Darwish makes certain to point out that there were key differences as well, certainly between the Jim Crow South and 1960s Israel. But what he's articulating here is a sense of shared struggle, a sense of deep resonance and understanding of what it means to be discriminated against, to be seen as less than. After all, Palestinian citizens of Israel and Black Americans both attended segregated schools, lived in segregated neighborhoods, both found themselves often subject to police harassment and security violations. Both Palestinian citizens of Israel and Black Americans often found themselves discriminated against when they applied for jobs or to college. So Palestinians have long been familiar with the stories of Black Americans. But what about the other way around? Turns out that during this time period, especially in the 1960s, very few Americans were familiar with Palestinian stories. There weren't a lot of Palestinians living here in the United States, and there wasn't, frankly, much interest. Into this void stepped Exodus, the blockbuster novel by Leon Uris that was published in 1958, and the even more blockbuster movie that came out 2 years later. As many of you may recall, Exodus tells the story of the founding of the State of Israel out of the ashes of the Holocaust. It's an epic tale, full of triumph and redemption. It inspired millions of Americans and millions more around the world to identify with the Jewish state. Now, I was too young to live through the Exodus craze, but I understood how deeply it impacted how Americans recognized and thought about Israelis and Palestinians, how it shaped their discursive framework. And so a few years ago, for a project, I decided to read the novel and watch the movie. And then I read the novel again and watched the movie again. And what I realized was that in Exodus, telling Israel's story depended upon denying Palestinians their story. Stories like that of my parents. My mother was 3 years old in 1948. She was living in the middle-class neighborhood of Al-Ajami in the coastal city of Jaffa, beautiful city surrounded by citrus groves. In April of 1948, Zionist paramilitary forces began shelling her neighborhood. My grandfather rushed everyone out towards the sea. They climbed into a fishing trawler and sailed north, first to Beirut, then to Syria. My grandfather eventually got a job in Libya, which is where my mother grew up. Her brothers and sisters are scattered around the world. My mother, who's 76 years old, still longs to see Jaffa herself. My father was 11 years old in 1948. He was living in the southern Palestinian village of Barbara, known for its luscious grapes and prickly pears. In October that year, the Israeli Air Force began dropping bombs in his village. When one landed in their neighbor's yard, my paternal grandfather rounded up his family, and they fled on foot southwards towards the Gaza Strip, where the majority of my father's family still lives today. These stories, and hundreds of thousands of others like them, were rendered invisible by Exodus. They were even rendered unthinkable. The Exodus phenomenon was so pervasive in 1960s America that even those we typically associate with having a justice framework still expressed strong support for Israel. One example was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Shortly before his assassination in 1968, Dr. King said, quote, "Peace for Israel means security, and we must stand with all our might to protect her right to exist." There are many reasons why, and there's been a lot of scholarship done on this, by the way. There are many reasons why Dr. King expressed his strong support for Israel. Part of it stemmed from his Christian beliefs. Part of it, I would contend, stemmed from the fact that he was familiar with Israeli stories, from people he met, from his activist work and civil rights work. And unlike Malcolm X, who visited the region in 1964 and went to the Gaza Strip and visited and met with Palestinians, Dr. King never made it to the region. So I wonder what Dr. King would have thought about Israel and Palestinians had he lived long enough to witness the occupation, had he lived long enough to hear Palestinian stories. Of course, we'll never know the answer for sure. But what we do know is that around the time of his assassination in 1968, growing numbers of Black internationalist activists and Palestinian activists were seeing and making connections between their respective struggles against both racism and imperialism. They recognized these dual scourges as intertwined. One example of this was Angela Davis. As many of you know, Angela Davis is a Black activist, scholar, and feminist. In 1971, she was arrested on dubious charges for her political work. Because Angela Davis recognized the global connections between American racism and imperialism, she was known among people throughout the world. This included Palestinian women. On International Women's Day, on March 8th of 1971, women from the Arab Women's League of Jordan, which was comprised primarily of Palestinian women refugees, wrote a letter to Angela Davis, a letter of support while she was still imprisoned. In it, it wrote in the letter, "To all people, you represent the fighter for democracy, peace, and progress. To us, you represent the fighter against an imperialist state backing the Israeli aggression against our people." So you see, the Palestinian women writing to Angela Davis understood the connections between American imperialism and Israeli colonization. They understood the connections of racism and imperialism. So these ideas showed that even though they didn't meet Angela Davis personally themselves, they still had a sense of compassion towards her because of their shared struggle for justice. Now, this letter was just one small part of a much larger phenomenon that was happening throughout the 1970s and 1980s. During those decades, people the world over mobilized to end the apartheid in South Africa. They understood that a regime built on domination and segregation was inherently violent and inherently unjust. Segregation and domination never lead to peace. They can only lead to more suffering. And just as structural violence is connected, so too must the struggle to end it, which is why even as the US government and the Israeli government supported the South African apartheid regime, Black Americans and Palestinians were at the forefront of the struggle to end it. By the early 1990s, they were successful. Formal apartheid in South Africa ended, and the systems of domination and segregation, while still present today, were alleviated substantially. But just as that was happening in South Africa, another system of domination and segregation was becoming further entrenched. Does anyone remember this photo? This is the signing of the Oslo Accords in September of 1993 between PLO chairman Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, overseen by a very proud of himself Bill Clinton. I remember watching this on television with my dad. You guys remember Peter Jennings? Peter Jennings had on a panel of experts, and they were giddy with the prospect that peace was at hand. My dad was muttering some choice Arabic words under his breath. I turned to him and asked, somewhat naively, "Isn't this a good thing?" "No," he said. "They're not actually ending the occupation. They're just hiding it." A few minutes later, one of the panel experts said something about how the newly established Palestinian Authority would have municipal responsibilities. "Ha," my dad said. "You hear that? Municipal. All they're going to do is let the Palestinians collect the garbage." Turned out my dad was kind of right. Oslo did not end the occupation. It just created a middleman, the PA. The peace framework that informed the Oslo Accords and the whole quote-unquote peace process that followed it defined peace as the absence of violence rather than the establishment of justice. As a result, human rights, especially for Palestinians, went out the window. In 1999, the leading Israeli human rights group B'Tselem put out a report in which they said, quote, "It was hoped that the peace process between the two parties would lead to an improvement in human rights in the occupied territories. However, no such improvement has taken place." The peace framework presumes equal power between the two parties. We heard constantly throughout the 90s that if both parties would just come to the table, if both sides would just compromise a little bit more, we could have peace. The problem is that the two sides do not have equal power. To give you just a couple of examples, from 1967 until today, approximately 1 million Palestinians have been arrested by Israel. That's 40% of the adult male population. That includes 50,000 minors and children. 0 Israelis have been arrested by Palestinians. Today, there are approximately 4,600 Palestinians sitting in Israeli prisons. 500 of them are under what's called administrative detention. That means they're held indefinitely without charge or trial. 6 of them are currently on a hunger strike to protest their detention. No Israelis are held in Palestinian prisons. All of the Palestinians, all of the 3.2 million Palestinians living in the West Bank have to at some point cross an Israeli checkpoint, like this one. No Israelis have to cross a Palestinian checkpoint. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, between 2000 and 2005, 67 Palestinian mothers were forced to give birth at one of these checkpoints because they were not allowed through. And 36 of their babies died. Israel maintains that all of these measures are necessary for security purposes. They point to acts of spectacular violence in order to enact far more pervasive structural violence. And this is the key to understanding what is happening on the ground. Speaking of mothers, I remember a time in 2002 when I was speaking in a synagogue in downtown Chicago. I was with my Israeli friend, whom I mentioned earlier. It was during the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, and tensions were high. We had been going kind of on a mini speaking tour, talking about current events. During the question and answer session, a woman stood up and asked me, in all sincerity, "Can you explain to me, why don't Palestinian mothers love their children?" I was sure I misheard the question. "Excuse me," I said. She repeated it, with other people in the audience nodding in agreement. She added, "If Palestinian mothers love their children, why would they let them confront the Israeli soldiers?" It was one of those moments I felt my blood rushing, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. I got outraged. Of course Palestinian mothers love their children. They're human beings, after all. On the drive home, I was thinking about my own mother and how she would move mountains to protect me and my sisters and my brother. And I thought about those Palestinian mothers who lost their babies at checkpoints, and I was outraged. Looking back on it now, with some time and some more compassion, both for myself and for her, I realized that she had probably never met a Palestinian mother before, and she had probably never heard any of their stories. I knew it was hard for me to find stories about Palestinians in the mainstream media, so could I really blame her? I've always been curious, as I've said, I've always been curious to know about Palestinian coverage in mainstream US media, but last year I decided to try to quantify it. How pervasive is this phenomenon? And so, it being the pandemic and I wasn't going anywhere, I did a search. I looked up 4 major US publications and looked up all of their opinion pieces about Palestinians over a 50-year period. I know it sounds like a lot. Here's what I found for the New York Times. Between January 1st, 1970 and the end of 2019, the New York Times ran nearly 2,500 opinion pieces that discussed Palestinians. These include editorials from the editorial board, columns from regular columnists, op-eds, and guest columnists. Out of those nearly 2,500 opinion pieces, fewer than 2% of them were actually written by Palestinians. And so it turns out that it's really hard for Palestinians to get their stories told in America's newspaper of record. Now, of course, this is not a phenomenon that is unique to Palestinians. Studies have also shown that many other communities of color and other marginalized communities likewise are underrepresented in our mainstream media outlets. There are lots of reasons for this, both structural and, I would argue, discursive. But I've also noticed over the past decade that we're seeing a massive shift happening in how Americans learn about other parts of the world and how Americans also learn more about what's happening here at home. And as a result, they're sharing with one another not only each other's stories, but they're also taking meaningful action to try to Many people noticed striking similarities between police violence against protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, and Israeli violence against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian Americans, a number of them, went to Ferguson to join in the protests, and Palestinians in the occupied territories used the hashtag Palestine to Ferguson to tweet out advice to protesters about how to deal with things like tear gas, armored tanks, and curfews, which of course they're all quite familiar with. The following year, a group of Black and Palestinian artists and activists put out a video that they called "When I See Them, I See Us." And it consisted of a series of stills overlaid with a poem that highlights the parallel structures of violence and oppression that both Palestinians face as well as Black Americans. Now, the point is not to compare suffering, nor is the point to say that they are the same. Rather, the point is that when we share our stories with one another, when we understand one another's suffering, we can then take meaningful action. We also saw this phenomenon last year during the worldwide protests of outrage following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. As many of you, I'm sure, know, there were huge protests not only across the United States, but around the world. So many people identified with George Floyd as a victim of state violence, as someone who was racialized, minoritized, and victimized by a society and by a structure that did not value his life. That was also true in Palestine. A number of murals were drawn to commemorate George Floyd, including this one in the Gaza Strip. Notably, it shows George Floyd and a heart, symbolizing one half Black Americans and the other half of the heart, Palestinians in Gaza with barbed wire around them, signaling their besiegement and enclosement. Many people refer to Gaza as the largest open-air prison in the world. This mural was drawn by a group called We Are Not Numbers. This is a group of young Palestinians. It was formed in 2015 following the 2014 assault on Gaza. It was young Palestinians who were tired of hearing themselves reported in international news only in terms of statistics. 10 Palestinians killed, 12 Palestinians killed. So they wanted to share their stories with the world. And you can read them on their website, wearenotnumbers.org. What's striking to me in particular about this mural is that even as these young Palestinians under siege in Gaza, with so much anguish that they share in their stories, they nonetheless found it in them to show compassion for people suffering halfway around the world. And so that despite the bombs and the violence that they were facing, they recognized these parallel structures of violence, not identical, but ones that deeply resonated with one another. In other words, they were showing compassion. We also saw this sense of shared justice just this past May. Despite media reports that tended to talk about a renewed cycle of violence, as if Israelis and Palestinians hold the same amount of power, millions of people around the world took to the streets, demanding Palestinian freedom. They knew, even though it wasn't reported in the mainstream media, many of them knew about the Jewish-only settlements that were built on stolen Palestinian land. They knew about the bypass roads and the color-coded license plate scheme that prevents Palestinians from being able to drive on them. Many of them knew that even within Israel itself, Palestinian citizens are often barred from moving into Jewish-only neighborhoods, are still discriminated against in hiring, in college admissions. They're still often taken and beaten by police. Huge numbers of them over 2,000 of them, were arrested in May during their protests as well. These protesters around the world called these systems of domination and segregation by its name, apartheid. They called on people to stand up against this system of oppression and work together to end it. This is coming at a moment when here in the United States, we're also seeing a new language that's being used, renewed language that's being used to get under the surface of what we typically tell ourselves about ourselves. We learn in elementary school and elsewhere that America was founded as a democracy, as a safe haven for people from religious persecution. More and more, however, people are talking about America's settler colonial roots, about how this great country was founded on the legacies and on the ashes of enslavement and genocide. These are justice frameworks. They're modes of analysis that look to the structures of oppression, both historical and contemporary, and argue that we must find ways to restore justice in order for us to move forward. So remember this poll from earlier in my talk? So as I said, it seems to show at first glance a fairly steady phenomenon of support for Israel. But if we look closer, we find that there's actually a huge partisan divide that's emerged in recent years, with Republicans overall reporting much stronger support for Israel than in the past, and Democrats reporting much less support for Israel than in the past. Some of this reflects the hyper-partisan atmosphere that we all live in. Some of this represents the media echo chambers that we're often subjected to. But I would argue something else is going on as well. If we look at this poll taken this past May, we also see that there's a stark divide among different age categories as well. Among the older folks, ages 65 and older, whom I lovingly term the Exodus generation, we tend to see much stronger support for Israelis than for Palestinians. Among the youngest cohort, those ages 18 to 34, we see slightly more support for Palestinians as compared to Israelis. Now, to be sure, majorities in all of these age groups reported having either sympathy for both sides or not having much of an opinion at all. But I'm interested in the trend line that we see happening in this generational divide. What's also fascinating to me is that we see this generational divide even among communities that are traditionally thought of as stalwart supporters of Israel. For example, this poll that was also taken by researchers at the University of North Carolina of young American evangelical Christians found that between 2018 and 2021, support for Palestinians had increased significantly, support for Israelis had decreased, and support for neither or not sure had increased as well. Now, all of these polls, I must admit, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, because these questions about sympathy or support are really getting at issues of empathy. They're really asking people about empathy. And I, of course, am more interested in compassion. That's why I also found this poll particularly interesting. This was done by the Jewish Electorate Institute over this past summer. They interviewed nearly 2,000 Jewish American voters of all ages, backgrounds, political affiliations, about a whole range of issues. These two stood out to me, though. It showed that far greater numbers of younger American Jews, those aged 40 and under, agreed with the statement that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. That was a far higher number, especially as compared to older Jewish Americans who were polled. And most surprising, to me at least, is that 38% of American Jews under the age of 40 agreed with the statement that Israel is an apartheid state. So what's going on here? I would contend that there are two things that we can take away from these polls. The first is that younger Americans of all backgrounds, of all religious affiliations, are increasingly analyzing the world through a justice framework, not thinking in terms of identity or us versus them, but rather thinking in terms of causes, in terms of structural oppression, and in terms of ending that structural oppression for all. As a result, more and more younger Jewish Americans are rejecting the conflation of the state of Israel with their Jewish identity. The second thing that's happening is that more and more Americans across the board, younger ones, are able to hear Palestinian stories for the first time as a result of social media, alternative media outlets. But it's not a one-way street. Young Palestinians, as we saw with We Are Not Numbers, they're also looking to learn more stories and engage with others around the world. This is Mus'ab Abu Toha. He is a 30-year-old Palestinian poet and writer. He was born in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Mus'ab loves American and British literature, so much so that he majored in it in the Islamic University in Gaza. A few weeks before he was set to graduate in 2014, Israeli airstrikes disrupted those plans. Israeli airstrikes bombarded the Islamic University of Gaza, destroying its library. Mus'ab was crushed. As he was going through the rubble of his former library, he came across a copy of Norton's Anthology of American Literature. He cherished it. He gingerly rubbed the dust and debris off of it and took a picture of himself with it. Shared it on social media. Soon, friends from around the world were sending books to Mus'ab to replenish his collection. And soon after that, he founded the Edward Said Library in Gaza, a repository for English language books, so that young Palestinians in Gaza can have access to the rest of the world, a world they're not allowed to travel to. In 2019, Harvard University invited Musab to come to Cambridge for a fellowship. But as a stateless Palestinian, meaning a Palestinian who has no citizenship, it was not as easy as it sounded. Musab eventually did make it to the United States after a very harrowing and Kafkaesque journey. He even came here to Tucson, where I had the pleasure of meeting him in February of 2020, shortly before the pandemic shut everything down. At the University of Arizona, Musab gave a talk with our very own Professor Noam Chomsky about the realities of civilian life in Gaza. The auditorium was full. People were eager to hear stories about Palestinians in Gaza. You can still catch it, by the way, on SBS's YouTube page. I highly recommend it. After the event, I noticed on Facebook someone was upset that there weren't any Israeli speakers on stage. They accused the organizers of bias. That's the tricky thing about the peace framework. The peace framework tricks us into thinking of empathy as a zero-sum game. It's either us or it's them. But we know, as Leslie and Jay have showed us, that there's more than enough compassion to go around for everyone. So where does this leave us? On the one hand, structural violence continues unabated. Censorship remains for those who speak out against it. But on the other hand, I'm seeing more and more interest in hearing Palestinian stories. And it's pretty cool how many of these up-and-coming Palestinian storytellers are women. They include writers like Naomi Shihab Nye. Some of you may recall Naomi came to the University of Arizona Poetry Center. I've long been a fan of Naomi's poetry. As a mother, I'm especially pleased at how her poetry is able to resonate with readers of all ages. These storytellers also include visual storytellers, like our very own Sema Ashaibi. Sema is a School of Art professor here at the University of Arizona and a recent recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. Sema uses photography and sculptural installations. She was born in Iraq to an Iraqi father and a Palestinian mother, and so she uses her work to tell untold stories of war, exile, and displacement. One of the things I love about Sema's work is that she's able to take these stories into some of the most prestigious and high-end art spaces in the world, spaces that normally don't hear a lot of these stories. We also have storytellers like Mona El-Kurd, a 23-year-old social media activist living in East Jerusalem, in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Mona has 1.6 million followers on Instagram as she's been documenting her family's struggle against the attempts to evict them, against the attempts to expel them from their homes by extremist Israeli settlers. She's part of a new generation of digitally connected and globally oriented young activists. We all desire to see peace in the world, but if we truly want to end suffering, our work must be grounded in justice. At Palestine solidarity rallies growing up, I would often hear the chant, "No justice, no peace." When I saw this sign, I thought it was from one of those rallies. It turns out it was taken at a protest here in Tucson in 2016, demanding that Black lives matter. And so the message is essentially the same. Only when there's justice will there be peace. So where do we go from here? It's a difficult question, frankly, and I don't have all the answers. I'm very much looking forward to next week's speaker, Lamarad Owen, as I think he'll be able to give us some great advice. For now, I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts. If we remember that the definition of compassion revolves around holding space for the suffering of others and taking meaningful action to alleviate that suffering, we have a little bit of a roadmap from where to go from here. So the first suggestion I have is to listen to other people's stories. And you can even start tonight, believe it or not, by turning on Netflix. Now, I did not plan it this way, but last week Netflix released a collection of 32 Palestinian films, shorts, and documentaries. Appropriately enough, the collection is called Palestinian Stories. I really didn't plan it that way, but I was very happy to see it. Listening to those stories, though, can be uncomfortable, especially if we feel like we're being implicated in the suffering of others. One of the great ways in which we can move past that comfort to a space of compassion is to work together to really try to understand those stories and bring them to others. One group that's doing that is an Israeli group called Zochrot. Zochrot is a Hebrew word that means remembrance. And their aim is to tell Palestinian stories of the Nakba to other Israelis. It's difficult work. As you might imagine, lots of people are not interested in hearing these stories. What I particularly find admirable about Zochrot is that not only that they're sharing those stories, but they're taking meaningful action to try to allow for Palestinian refugees, to call on Palestinian refugees to have the right of return. And so this brings me to my second suggestion, to take meaningful action. For some, that'll mean joining groups. Tonight, I see some of my friends from the Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance and from Jewish Voice for Peace. They're at the forefront of connecting these issues of justice both at home and around the world. But not everyone has the time or the energy to join a group. But we can still take meaningful action on an individual level. I'm reminded here of a story that I learned as a child about the Muslim prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Prophet Muhammad's message was also one that at its heart was a message of justice. The Prophet Muhammad taught that it didn't matter how wealthy you were or what your position was in society. All that mattered is that you were a person of faith and that you treated others well. Lots of people in his hometown of Mecca did not like this message. One of them, a neighbor of his, showed her contempt by dropping her garbage on his front step every morning. And every morning, as he opened the door to begin his day, he would start by moving that garbage off to the side and proceeding. One morning, he opened his front door and there was no garbage there. He inquired what was going on and was told that this neighbor had fallen ill. She was bedridden. Do you know what the Prophet Muhammad did? He went and visited her, wished her a speedy recovery. This story tells me that we can and must extend compassion to every individual that we meet in our lives, even if they don't treat us with compassion. And that doing so does not in any way take away from our cause for justice. I began tonight by talking about God as the most compassionate. When Muslims invoke God the most compassionate, it's not just a call for grace from on high. It's also a reminder that we should practice compassion in our daily lives as well. So let's work together to extend compassion to all, even as we also work together to ensure justice for all as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, fabulous, moving. Thank you so much, Maha. Really just wonderful. I hope to see you all here next week for Lama Ram, and we're going to hear about compassion and racial justice from a Buddhist perspective. Thank you all for coming and for watching.